Okay, in this video we're going to cover a little bit of what is involved in putting a second gen Dodge Neon motor into a first generation Dodge Neon. I've got the car motor physically in the car, but it takes a lot of work. In this case I put the motor and transmission in together as one unit, and from the factory Dodge put these in from underneath the car. So in this case I did that as well. I lifted the car up. I've got the motor and transmission on a mover's dolly down there. And what's interesting about this is if you do it this method, it's not bad. It saves you from having to unmate the transmission from the motor. But there's not a lot of tolerance. You can see here in the front motor mount on the car. There's a bit of room there. It's actually not too bad. Where it gets real tight is down here on the K-member. For the lower control arms, you have to remove the lower alternator mount, and in fact, even with my phone stuffed in here, it's still really hard to see that there's actually any clearance, but there is. And then the other part where it gets tight is the driver's side of that same K-member, trying to get down around the transmission. And again, even just trying to get my phone in here, you can see that there is clearance, but we're not talking about a lot. And so where that becomes really important is, in order to do this at all and make it work, you can't have any accessories on the motor. Power steering pump, alternator, AC compressor, and their mounts is a good idea, especially if you're doing the second gen motor in the first gen car like I'm doing here, because the mounts are different anyway, so they need to come off. And then the exhaust and intake manifolds will not fit. The valve cover on the second generation is actually different than the first generation. I took the time to swap that before I put that in the car. Obviously that wouldn't be a big inconvenience. Where there's another notable difference though is this timing belt cover and motor mount are completely different on the second generation than they are in the first generation. And yeah, there's not a lot of room here. You actually have to pull a harmonic balancer, and that requires a Chrysler only tool. I rent it at my local O'Reilly's. I'm sure most of the other ones carry it, or if you've got one of your own, that's great. But the timing belt cover and this mount need to be changed. I would not do that in the car. If you have the ability to do it out of the car, it will save you a lot of time and blood probably from many knuckle scrapes. After that, the front motor mount is different. Transmission mount is different. Those can be swapped in the car. The wiring harness obviously is different. You're going to need a first gen engine harness and accessories, at least alternator, and I believe it's just the alternator that will be different. It has its own harness. You could cut and paste, take the plug end off of the second generation harness for the alternator and put it on the first generation harness. The alternators are physically the same, they just use a different electrical connection. So you could use the second generation's alternator if you don't have a first generation alternator to use. After that, and when I pull a motor, you'll see here I leave the power steering system closed and just tied out of the way, so that one, I don't lose any fluid, I don't make a mess, I don't have to put fluid back in it and re-bleed it when I put the new motor in. I do the same thing with the AC system, especially in the case of this one, it's actually holding pressure. And so there's a chance that this car may have air conditioning again. And so that does take up a little bit more room. If you didn't care about the air conditioning, and if maybe for whatever reason your power steering is out of the car, perhaps you could leave the front or leave the intake manifold on. The concern comes into this clearance here. There just really is not a lot of room between this motor mount area and the front of the motor. Beyond that, you're going to need the intake and exhaust manifolds from the first generation motor. You're also going to need these heater core lines. They redid them on the second generation, and instead of running kind of as the crow flies from the water outlet and thermostat area, they run straight up and then across, which is kind of nice. It gives you more room to get the starter in and out. Unfortunately, that lifted pipe prevents the first generation's intake manifold from mating against the head, and so it's got to go. You got to swap those out. The second generation's heater core lines mounted here. You're not going to need that. And the first generations are supposed to mount down here. Unfortunately, I broke that bolt off, but there's an additional bolt here on the side of the motor. Yeah, here. And while you're at it, you're going to need to take this little condenser diode that's not on the second generation car, so you're going to want to grab that while you're taking those heater core lines. But then, even with my broken bolt, these lines aren't going anywhere. They've got a little play in them, but they're not enough to worry me. The rest of the sensors don't need to be changed as long as you've got a first generation harness to use. The water outlet here is the same, as well as here at the water pump. And then, in addition to the mounts over here, you need the first generation dipstick. This is still the second generation dipstick. The first generation car, the battery box, and electrical fuses for under the hood sit here, and this dipstick would get in the way. I've left it in for now so that I don't get dirt into the transmission, because that's a pretty big open hole. The second generation car also uses a loom here for these couple of sensors on the transmission, and it's harnessed. So you can take that off, you can undo the harness and take that off when you pull the motor from the second generation car. But on the first generation car, those harnesses are a part of the car. So you're going to need to pull that loom off so that you can use this one instead. And then as well, you need to pull the shift linkage and kickdown cable linkages, because they are different on the first generation car than they are on the second generation car. And I should note, this is an early second generation. I think it's a 2000 or 2001. It happens to have the same 3-speed transmission as the first generation car. Now, if you've got the 4-speed coming out of the second generation, I don't know what's involved in getting that into the first generation car. I have not encountered that yet. So do your homework or try it. That's how I learn. After that, pretty much everything's going to be the same as it was on the first generation. So I think that covers most of it. Obviously, I've got a lot of work to do here. I've got to pull my engine harness through, put the manifolds on, the engine mounts, lift the motor up, mount it in the car, etc., etc. But that should give you an idea of what's involved.